Hi, my name's David Bruce. So there's quite a common question that I get from people when they hear that I write operas. I mean, there are several questions. Does it have to be in Italian? No. Does it have to involve heroines jumping off ramparts? No. Although that does happen quite a lot, more on that in a moment. Lots of people want to know what comes first, the words or the music. But a lot of people are also just curious. How on earth do you go about writing something on such a huge scale as an opera? Where do you begin? I've written 4 full-length operas now and a number of short 10-minute ones. And writing those short operas really was my way into it. I can't recommend it highly enough as a way to get started. And doing it over a 10-minute scale makes the stakes a lot lower and the pressure a lot lower as well. So I thought I'd talk through the whole process as it happened with my last opera, which was called Nothing, and was premiered in Glyndebourne a couple of years ago. The piece has already had one revival in the Danish town of Aarhus, and I'm really pleased to say there are plans for a new production coming, which will be the first time I've ever had a second production of one of my operas. So stage 1 is to find a subject you're happy with. And this goes into your philosophy of what you think an opera is. Is it just a story with music? Or is there something deeply connected about the way the story is being presented through singing and through music that makes this particular story work in the opera world? So there are a whole bunch of different reasons you can find for why people need to be singing. My old mentor George Benjamin said it recently in a New Yorker article. To pray, to march, to gain unanimity, to mock, to celebrate. That's public singing. Private singing, feeling good, feeling ecstatic, equally grief. The only way to express grief is through non-verbal sounds, to cry or to sing. In opera, what singing means is that these words can't be said. There's something elemental, hopefully, something deep and powerful which needs more than just words. An example I often give from my own work is my opera Push, which featured 6 different mothers in the process of childbirth. And you can see that at that moment, a mother has as good a reason as any to be screaming at the top of her lungs. So that often leads to opera being about quite life and death issues. That's why operas almost always involve love or death or both. So an idea for a new opera can be an existing story, or of course you can make one up yourself. Probably the majority of new operas are based on existing stories, and the main reason for this is that it's much less risky for an opera company to take it on. It's an incredibly expensive thing to put on a new opera, and it's nice for the opera house to have some sense that there will be an audience for it. So you often get operas that are based on well-known films, like Dead Man Walking, for example, which was both a well-known film and then a very successful opera, or maybe a classic fairy tale, or based on a well-known character, like there was a recent opera about the life of Steve Jobs.
Computers in the future may perhaps weigh only 1.5 tons.
So the particular story for Nothing was brought to me by a colleague at one of the co-commissioners of Nothing, the Royal Opera House. It's a story that everyone knows in its native Denmark, and it's really well known throughout Europe, although people have only just started picking it up in the English-speaking world. And it straight away hit me as a story with potential because it deals with existential topics. It's about a class of school children, and one of whom, Pierre, gets up on his first day of term and says, "There's no point in anything, life is meaningless, we're all going to die." Typical teenager.
Nothing matters. Nothing.
And he goes and sits up a plum tree, and he spends the rest of the story up the plum tree. And I straight away fell in love with the idea of someone singing in a passionate operatic tone about the meaninglessness of life. Because singing and opera singing in particular are so full of life, I just felt there was a delicious and poignant contradiction there. In the rest of the story, Pierre's classmates are quite shocked by his provocation, and they set out to prove to him that life does have meaning. So they initially agree to sacrifice valued possessions, which to them do have meaning. So they start building what they call a pile of meaning. But Pierre just laughs at them and he says, well, You just chose the things that you were happy to give up, so that doesn't mean anything. So the classmates then decide to nominate each other to give up precious things. And this quickly spirals out of control, and they start vindictively giving each other harder and harder things to give up: a ponytail, a dead dog, eventually a finger, and even worse. And it ends up in the eventual murder of Pierre. So it's quite a brutal, dark tale. People often compare it to Lord of the Flies, but it really focuses in on the things that adolescent kids are often coming to terms with. What's the purpose of life? What am I doing here? And the story has a brilliant hole in it, in that it doesn't offer any answers to what is meaningful. It's just like a massive question. Pierre seems misguided in his feeling that there's no meaning, but also his classmates don't seem to have a satisfactory answer either. So it leaves you, the reader or the viewer, to answer these questions for yourself. And I felt like music could really underscore that and bring this mystery to life. So next, you need somebody to turn the story into a libretto you can work from. The libretto is just like a screenplay of the opera. So some composers do this themselves, although on the whole it doesn't work out so well. For me, working with a librettist has been one of the most pleasurable parts of the process, and I've been particularly lucky recently finding Glyn Maxwell, who's a wonderful poet and playwright I've mentioned a few times on the channel before. He's now written several of my librettos, and what tends to happen straight after we've found the story is we have to go down the pub and have long sessions hammering out the way we want to approach the story, how we want to present it, which characters we want to focus on. So Glyn might go away and write an act or even the whole libretto, and in the meantime I tend to go away and start work on some music, even though I don't yet have the words. I always want the music to feel like it has its own inner life. You know, the best operas seem to have this kind of magic to them where the music just seems to follow its own course, and it just seems to magically fit the story as well as making sense as music. And I think if you just get the text and you just work through it, setting each word one at a time, you end up with music that just feels like it's a slave to the text without a real life of its own. So I tend to write chunks of music in advance before I have any words, knowing of course the ballpark of what I'll be doing, so the kinds of atmospheres and textures I'll be needing, but not specifically thinking this will work for that particular scene. And then once I have some text from Glyn, I'll start trying to piece together bits of music with bits of text. It's always quite amazing how well things fit together, so I might find I've got a minute of music here, which is almost an exact music for this text here. But other times, of course, it does need stretching or squashing, and it's a process of deciding, is it the music that needs to give way to the words at this point, or do I need to ring up Glyn and ask him, could you add a few more words here, or can I cut that bit there? And sometimes there might be larger changes at this stage. For example, we were quite concerned in the early days of the piece that it might be too dark. Bear in mind we were writing for school kids who would have to spend several months involved with this material, and initially I'd thought of having a sort of light relief in the form of some younger school kids who were just puzzled bystanders watching these strange older kids coming and going with their piles of meaning. And the idea was that we could keep coming back to these little kids for comic relief. And Glyn did actually write several scenes for those little kids. But in the end, once I had the rest of the libretto from Glyn, I felt there was enough lightness in what he'd done already. So I felt we were able to dispense with that idea of those younger kids. But one of Glyn's particular skills is if I tell him a particular section needs a little phrase that will fit here, or a continuation of the previous idea, he'll always come back with just the perfect little piece to fit in the jigsaw. And I always feel that ends up making the whole piece really strong. Because you see time and again in new operas that there are whole sections where you think it's obvious that that section doesn't work for one reason or another. And in many cases what's happened is the librettist has finished their libretto, the composer's started work, maybe they've even realised that there's a problem, but the librettist either hasn't been willing to rewrite or they don't have that kind of relationship where that will work. So the composer has no choice but to just leave the problem there and put up with it. So I've always felt with Glyn that we've been able to overcome the majority of these problems and make the piece a lot stronger as a result. So I think the first thing I wrote on Nothing was Pierre's big aria to nothingness that he sings near the very end.
I to me nothing. I can see the whole world from here.
I also used a lot of this music as a sort of overture and aspects of it throughout the piece. It's almost like Pierre's sort of thinking, dwelling on things kind of music. I also got going on some of the more chant-like music for the kids. And one bit I particularly remember came in one of those wonderful flashes of inspiration, which was the Precious Things scene. And as you write, it's a question of thinking about the balances over the course of the piece, balancing the bigger moments versus the more intimate ones, the types of voice, so you don't get 5 soprano arias in a row, for example, and of course the whole, so that the whole flow of the drama and the music feel like they're balanced and make sense over the course of the act and the evening as a whole. The other thing I think about more and more is the audibility of the text. I always feel it's a bit of a problem in opera when you have those surtitles above the stage and everyone's watching the stage and then looking up to read them and then watching again. And I always feel that when you're writing a new opera and you know that's going to happen, well, that's a bit of a failure, really. You should write specifically knowing either the text doesn't matter, or if it does, you should try to make it audible. In the old days, the solution they had was to separate things out into recitatives and aria. So recitative was supposed to be the dialogues and getting the plot across. It's an almost spoken kind of singing where you're supposed to be able to hear the words. And then an aria is where you're stopping and expressing an emotion and the words maybe aren't so important, you can focus on the music. But many operas today ignore that distinction and seem to just accept that you're not going to hear the words, which I do, as I said, feel is a bit of a failure. But one opera which I admired recently was George Benjamin's Written on Skin. One of the things I particularly liked about it was that it was so delicate a lot of the time that you could actually hear what was going on.
Steps through the stone slit.
So I had that piece in mind as a bit of a model when I was starting to write nothing. So there was a lot of string pizzicati and harp. You do have to be really, really delicate to ensure that you get the text across. And then to counterbalance that, there are those moments in the piece where the school kids all become a sort of pack and singing in this more and more aggressive way as they join forces. So they end up with this animalistic kind of reaction to Pierre. So the balancing act for me became between those very gentle moments where you did follow the text and the big scenes with all of the school kids involved. Glyn probably spent a couple of months on and off writing the libretto, and I think I spent a year solid writing the music, which was actually really quick. I think more typically you'd take 2 or 3 years to write a full-length opera. This one somehow came out very quickly for me, and it was probably finished almost a year before the premiere, so the kids had time to look at the music, and then they rehearsed for several months in the weekends when they weren't at school. And one thing that surprises people is the full orchestra usually only shows up just a couple of days before the premiere. The rehearsals are all done with the pianist accompanying, a répétiteur as they're known. But when it's a world premiere, as a composer, you just have to accept how extremely late in the day the whole thing is. Your first chance to hear the full orchestration is literally a few days before the premiere. And it's so late, of course, that if anything's not working as you'd hoped, there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. It's far too late to change anything. So that's always good for the stress levels. One of the moments I still remember the most vividly, though, was when the school kids heard the live orchestra for the first time. So they'd been rehearsing away for months with just the piano, and they were just giddy with excitement to suddenly hear the 3D colours of the orchestra. So it was a very touching moment for me. So I hope that gives you a slightly clearer idea of the processes involved. It's certainly a very long and drawn out process, and it's a lot to think about as a composer. But I've found that writing operas has been one of the most exciting and rewarding challenges of my life.
Olaf, you're better than they are. I'm still throwing sticks. You're still running after.
So I'll leave you with a few more clips from the Glyndebourne production, and thanks so much to Glyndebourne for the initial wonderful experiences that I had with this opera. If you haven't already, do please consider subscribing to the channel. Please let me know in the comments if you've got any more questions about what it's like to write an opera. If you want to support the channel, do please join my patrons over at Patreon, and thanks so much to everyone who's already joined, and I'll see you next time.